Okay, it looks like the numbers keep jumping up, so I'm so excited to have everybody with us today. I'm going to go ahead and officially kick off our Elevate conference. My name is Debbie Espinosa, and I am the president and CEO of Find Food Bank, located here in the beautiful Coachella Valley. And for all of you that are joining us, yes, that is the Coachella that everybody is so excited about right now. If any of you are going to be coming into the area, a warm welcome from my food bank here in this area. Always wonderful to have visitors in the area supporting our work, and all of our music that comes here too as well. I'm also a certified nonprofit professional, and I am also a national board member on the board of directors for the Nonprofit Leadership Alliance. I am pleased to have this opportunity to welcome each of you, all from around the United States. We have more than 500 people that have registered for this conference in order to make sure that we can create social impact and be leaders through this work together on a time when we absolutely need to make sure that we are bound together to continue this work moving forward for the greater good of our organizations, for our communities, and our country. It's how we have the ability to focus on this equity needle within our personal lives, within our organizations, and within our community. And I'm welcoming all of you to our Elevate conference, which is a groundbreaking conference bringing us all together. So before I introduce our opening keynote speaker, the conference coordinators, of course, just like any conference that we would attend in person, wanted me just to mention just a few housekeeping items before we move forward. So first, there is a support room available throughout the conference. It's staffed with folks who can provide both technical support for the conference platform, as well as those who can answer any equity-related questions that you may have. You can access the support team from the menu at the top of the conference platform. Again, you can access the support team from the top of the menu on the conference platform. Second, the Nonprofit Leadership Alliance is offering an e-certificate in equity and inclusion. The digital badge can easily be uploaded to LinkedIn and other social and digital platforms. Be sure to complete all of the requirements to earn the badge. You can also find more information about the e-certificate, again, from the top menu of the conference platform. All right, so there's all the housekeeping. So now I am so excited to introduce our first keynote speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Shakti Butler. Dr. Butler is president and founder of World Trust Educational Services, a nonprofit that produces films, curricula, workshops, and programs that are catalysts for institutional, structural, and cultural change. Just one interesting point in Dr. Butler's significant background in equity work, and this is so cool, Dr. Butler. So glad to have you starting the conference off. She served as the diversity consultant and advisor on the Oscar-winning Disney animated film Zootopia, which focuses on challenging bias and systematic inequities. It is now my pleasure to turn the microphone over to Dr. Butler, who will kick off the conference for us. Thank you.
Good morning. It's almost like I can hear you saying good morning back to me. So I'm very happy to welcome you, and thank you, Debbie, for your beautiful introduction. There's a lot that I want to share with you, so I'm going to be going pretty quickly. We're talking about what does it take to create a bold dream, a dream in which we live in a world of belonging. And as Debbie mentioned to you, the name of our organization is World Trust, and we are really, really happy to be joining you today. So I love to begin by inviting us all to just take a moment to become present. And in order to do that, if you would just stop doing whatever else you might be doing in the moment and make sure that your hands are free and your feet are resting completely on the floor, and that your spine is nice and straight. In this way, you can take some deep breaths. And I'm going to ask that we, as a community across the country, take 3 deep breaths together. The best way I know to take a deep breath is to exhale first, Breathe in deeply. Hold it for a moment and then just let go. And if you can do that twice more at your own pace. Thank you. So this is called conocimiento, which is about building community, and it actually emerged from the farm workers movement in building equity and inclusion and fairness into the work of growing food and feeding the nation. And one of the things that they understood is that we always have to build community first, that we have to understand what our respective strengths are, and that we can combine our strengths to actually make change. So often we want to just jump to the answer of how we're going to fix this and how are we going to address that. But without building community, we really can't actually do the kind of work we need to do when times get challenging. I want to talk to you just a little bit about the meaning of belonging. What does it mean to belong? I've had the pleasure to work with John Powell at his wonderful conference on othering and belonging. And what we understand is that in order to create a nation of belonging, it's more than just being able to see one another. It is having people understand that they have the right to participate in creating the kind of structures that allow us to have equity and inclusion for all people. In order for us to build a world that works for everyone, we have to understand this concept of belonging. And what does it mean when there are many people, many situations, many circumstances in which we other one another? So what is equity actually? What we're talking about is building this capacity that we have relationships that are integrated, and that we develop the kind of emotional intelligence and analysis that allows us to actually interrupt systemic racism. Systemic racism, I say that because so often people think of racism as having only to do with how we behave as individuals. But in order to analyze what we're dealing with and interrupt systemic racism, and to question dominant culture and the structures that are produced within this system, then we have to be able to name what's actually going on. And so let's do that first. So when we understand, and by the way, for those of you who are really familiar with this, we're either listening to this with our learning caps on, so to speak, or our teaching caps on. So if you have all of this and it's really familiar with you, then perhaps this is a way that you can explain it to other people. But I like to talk about racialization as a system. And we understand that when we think about our human system, we know that in order for our human system to do its job, which is to keep us alive, there's a lot of communication that's going on inside of us that we're not even aware of. And the system of racialization operates in the same way. As a system, it too has a job, and its job is to perpetuate inequity. And it does it in this manner. The system of racialization is embedded in history, which most of us don't really learn in school very well. That history informs our culture, and that culture tells us who we are. But the system is run by power and economics that then produce what it produces internally, this bias, privilege, and internalized racism, but it also plays its role out externally in our interpersonal, institutional, and structural relationships. So what do I mean by structure when I talk about the system of inequity? And how is it different from the system itself? This is structure. When you look at these images, you can see that the structures, the parts of the body which support us, we can name. The structures that support racialization, we also can name. So if we start at the very top, we can look at our court system and going around in to the left, it's our educational system and the way money is handled and our legal systems and the media and how that interacts with global communities and housing and medical care and transportation and so on and so on. And so these structures are very important because they all have rules and regulations, but the primary message that's churned out is the same. When we can have a frame that can easily hold the complexity of what we're talking about, it makes it easier for us to see what's actually going on and decide how we want to take action so we can work towards this bold world that works for everyone, a world of belonging. I'm going to share with you a very short clip. We're just going to watch a couple of moments of it. At the beginning, there's no sound, but the sound will come on. So just pay attention, and we're going to watch this and one more thing and talk about it.
That's a song that was counting dead Indians back on the trails when they would kill Indians.
See all these little kids in uniform, and we'd be wondering how come they're like that. We weren't dressed like that, but these little kids were.
I remember being younger, growing up on the reservation, and being told, don't trust white people, don't listen to them. Never told why.
The government schools are constantly being built and hospitals added. We bring them in, clean them up, and start them on their way to civilization.
I would ask social services and human services audience, how many people know about residential boarding schools? How many people here do? This never makes it into the history books. This is never talked about.
Why did those schools get started, and who started them, and what was the rationale behind it?
So why did those schools get started, and who started them, and what's the rationalization behind them? And if I ask that question, if we were all in a big room together, probably many of you would talk about what happens and why we had Indian boarding schools or native boarding schools, not just here, but in Canada, in Australia, in South Africa. That the purpose of these boarding schools is to assimilate, to have culture shift into what we might call mainstream culture. But the real purpose is all about the land. And if you remember the diagram that you just saw, at the center of it was a piece that spoke to power and economics. So if we're going to actually make change, if we're going to create a world where people have their needs and rights recognized, we have to be able to notice something that is beyond our own experience. And we can do that. There are a lot of ways that we can do that. And I'm going to show you one more short clip, and then we'll talk about this just a little bit more.
There has been multi-generational trauma as it relates to people of African descent. Post-traumatic slave syndrome is really the direct assault on the most critical part of the culture, the relationships. That's what was assaulted with 339 years of chattel slavery. The relationship of a mother with her child, a husband and wife, a brother with a sister. All of these relationships, you see, were assaulted. And what happens then when you're the very basis of your culture, the basis of what makes you a people is assaulted for 300 years. And so what I began to endeavor to do is to find out what is the nature of what caused our strength, our ability to be resilient, to survive it, and what residual injury is still floating around. And how then might we repair that injury? And the injury, of course, is to the relationships.
So sorry that was out of sync, but that is a short clip from a new film that we just finished called Healing Justice, which is a deep look at the relationship between trauma, how do we redefine justice, and what is healing. So this is totally critical. None of us who are participating in this, and even of course all the people who aren't, have anything to do with how history was created. And we all live in a culture that we also did not create. But we see who we are is a direct result of this history and this culture, and that the movement of, taking Indian land, having enslaved people, building railroads, doing all of those things that we use every single day as a part of what supports us in our daily lives, is really infused into structure. And that is infused into all of the institutions that are part of that structure. And it's infused into how we don't see each other, how our interpersonal relationships can be limited. But Joy DeGruy, who you just saw, said, it is about building relationships. And so when we talk about creating a world that works for everyone, we have to look on both the internal side of the system and the external side of the system, what's going on inside of us and making that visible to ourselves, and looking how it plays out in the relationships that we have and the policies that we create and how we move through the world. We can see when we look at these institutions that the outcomes of disparity are present in every single one of the structures that are pictured here. There are many ways that when we look at a system, what we're really talking about is we're talking about relationships, but we're also talking about patterns. And we look at these patterns and we can see them clearly in the law. And I don't have time to go through all of these slides with you, but I want to say that I will go through them very briefly so that we can bring this part to a conclusion, because understanding this gives us a challenge for why we're here and why we're doing the work that we're doing in the world. And what does it mean to communicate some of these ideas to other people who are not familiar with them? So if we look at the 1790 Naturalization Act, we understand that the doors were open to some people and not to others. And that this idea of who's a citizen and who can vote and serve on juries and hold office and property were really severely restricted to people of color, and that is still the case. That we removed Native Americans forcefully, again, so that we could have the land. But most of us don't understand how states were formed because we didn't necessarily learn that in school. The Jim Crow laws evolved because after the Civil War, we still needed cheap labor. And the laws that were created allowed us to arrest people of color, primarily African-American people, and conscript them back into doing that cheap labor so necessary for the economy. The Federal Housing Administration, to understand the meaning of offering government-backed loans, $120 billion worth of home loans between 1934 and 1962, with most of that property going to whites, what impact does that have long-term in the society that we live in? And that's a lot of money for those days. We all know about redlining. But what we don't necessarily understand is how ghettos were formed and what it means for people to live in poverty, not just people of color, but poor white people as well. We know that the primary way that we gather wealth or accumulate wealth in our families is by passing down property. The Social Security Act of 1935 specifically excluded two occupations: agricultural workers and domestic servants. So these are African Americans, Mexicans, Asians, and that this impact on trying to be able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps actually means that first you have to have boots, and then you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But this is really something that has worked against many, many people in this country. The Wagner Act, which I know personally, my father was the first Black Teamster ever hired in New York, was that it helped. Eventually, people of color were allowed into these unions, but for many, many years, well into the 70s, this was not the case. We can talk about redlining and how that happens by how you plan out your cities and what the cumulative effects are when you put a highway or a freeway through certain parts of cities, and that the people who are left there don't have access to what they need in order to live well. So I want to close in that part. I'm saying that if you look at these policies and laws, that you understand that these patterns and relationships are very systemic and infused into our structures. I would like to leave you with a push, really, for you to use one of the resources called Strategic Questioning by Fran Peavy. If I could wave a magic wand and infuse this into society as a whole, into culture, it probably would be one of the first things that I would do. Because what we're talking about is, how do we all participate in the creation of social change that not only promotes equity, but inclusion, this sense of belonging, which is all about including? And how do these new visions arise within our families and our communities and our societies? And we look at communication and what that means to transmit communication in the way that we're normally taught in school, which is to get the answer, as opposed to another kind of communication that is focused on what could be and upon the creation of not only an active participation in the present, but in the future as well. So I'm going to take a deep breath because I feel like I've been moving at the rate of a high-speed train. I want to say that this is just a frame that we can refer to when we talk about, well, how do we actually make progress in the world? And who is that for? This is another resource I would really like you to take advantage of. It's called the Equity and Empowerment Lens, created by Multnomah County. Oftentimes when we are trying to make change, we're not recognizing that we're missing questions that need to be asked in order to produce that change. And this book, which you can download for free from the internet, shows you what it means to ask the questions that you may not normally think about when you're trying to make structural change inside of your institution. This equity and empowerment lens, it really helps us think about issues in a new way, and it brings new ideas into focus that we can expand. And we need support. We need to think in new ways. And if we're not thinking in new ways, if we're not using the kind of tools that might be available to us to see what we're missing, so to speak, then we can't make the progress that we'd like to make. So I'm going to bring this to a close by talking to you about a whale. So I live in Oakland, California, in the Bay Area. And a while ago, there was an article in the San Francisco Chronicle about a whale that was in danger swimming near the Farallon Islands, which is near the Golden Gate Bridge. And this whale was weighted down by tons of ropes, and she was going to die. Someone spotted her and called the powers that be, and they assessed the situation. And they sent in a team of divers to free this whale. And they worked for hours using curved knives to cut the ropes that were binding her. And one of the divers, the one who worked on cutting the ropes around her mouth, said the whole time that he was cutting these ropes away, that this whale just stared at him. And when she was free, she swam around and kind of gently bumped each of the divers that had helped cut the ropes away from her, as if to say thank you. And the young man who was cutting the ropes from her mouth said, yes, she was watching him, but he felt that his whole life changed, that he would never be the same again. I would like to suggest that we need each other. We need each other to cut away the ropes that are binding us, that are keeping us from being free, that are keeping us from seeing people who may fall into that category that we would refer to as other. But that I do believe that we have the capacity, and if we have the will, to really look in the face what it means to have a conversation about race in this country and how it is robbing all of us of what we could produce, then I think we'll be onto something. And I'm sure that this conference will support you in this. Have a great, great conference.
Thank you, Dr. Butler, for centering us and bringing us all together for an important message to kick off our conference. I'm Caitlin Hudgens, the Director of Strategic Partnerships with the Nonprofit Leadership Alliance. You'll be hearing from me throughout the live sessions these next couple of days. This concludes our opening keynote session. I encourage you all to come back to watch our next live session with Amikela Gaston. She will be facilitating a live discussion in the networking lounge immediately following the close of her presentation. Welcome to everyone again, and enjoy.